In 1979, I became a college professor at a Baptist college in Atlanta called Mercer University. And there are lots of great stories about those days I'd like to tell you. For example, my first teaching assignments were in the federal and state penitentiaries, where I taught English literature of the 19th century, the history of classical music, religion, and ethics. My first ethics course I taught in a weight room where I sat on the bench where they did bench presses. Taught Aristotle's Ethics, Augustine's Confessions, and Aquinas's Questions on Love from the Summa. But the moment that was perhaps the most confusing to me as a teacher was when I got into a public argument with my dean, who was a wonderful woman, over grading. Because I was of the opinion that we should be honest with our students, and we should give them the grades they earn, and that we should turn back this thing called grade inflation. And I was giving a lot of C's and a few D's, and this evidently wasn't done at a small college where you need students to pay tuition. You don't want them to go somewhere else. And so I made the point to the dean and other faculty that if we were trying to teach our students virtues like honesty and justice, it should begin with how we grade them. And that our grades were essentially lies to them, telling them that they were B students or A students when they were not. I was told that grades weren't really about judging student performance. Grades were about making students feel good about whatever effort they had put forth. In other words, we were building their self-esteem. And over the years that I taught, 15 years I taught philosophy, I heard a lot about the importance of self-esteem in education at every level, especially among the young. Then one bright morning, I was reading the paper. This would have been in the late 80s, that a national survey, an international survey had been made comparing test results in math and science between American students, Japanese students, and students from European nations. And they tested the actual attainment versus the satisfaction or self-esteem that students had in what they knew. And a very interesting result came back. Japanese students uniformly had the highest level of attainment in the areas of math and science and the lowest self-esteem. Whereas American students had the lowest actual attainment in the area of math and science and the highest degree of self-esteem. Now, nothing better illustrates both the point we've been making about happiness and the way in which feeling good about yourself gets in the way of actual virtue, of an actually good life, how it becomes self-deception. And the second point that I want to talk about today is, that is, can we be happy in America? Can we be happy in America? Because frankly, we've heard a lot of complaining about television, which I don't think is quite as demonic as some of people here have said. But television does purvey, as does the other media, this culture that is so concerned with how we feel about ourselves, building self-esteem. Now, all of you who have young children or who are teachers of young children know that children do learn better when they have confidence. I call that self-love. Self-love is different from self-esteem in that when you love something, you love what's really there, not what you pretend to be there. Because love being a virtue begins with the true knowledge of what you love. It may have some illusions at first, but gradually, 7 or 8 years later, you figure out who you're really in love with. The self-esteem mania, I believe, was and has been and still is promulgated by the talk shows. You know, if I were to say what makes it the most difficult to be happy in America, I'd say it's the talk shows. Now that sounds a little bit silly, and maybe it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but when I started teaching in 1979, and I'm sure Father Shaw can corroborate what I'm saying in Carlson, other teachers in the room, I began teaching people who had a healthy respect for intelligent, reasonable discussion that was linear and was about argumentation. But very quickly in the early 80s, my students came into class expecting it to be the Phil Donahue show. They expected that I was supposed to be a talk show host who entertained them and who essentially applauded every emotional outburst they had to make. And if they said, well, I really feel this is true, I'm supposed to go, ooh, ah, that's so interesting. Aren't you wonderful for sharing that with the rest of us? But when I said, I don't care about your feelings, I wish I had $1 for every time I said that as a teacher. I really don't care. In fact, I'm annoyed. Because your feelings don't establish anything. They establish nothing except you're sharing some private moment with us. But naturally, the talk shows and not Dr. Hudson won. Because the culture is a lot bigger than any single person in this room or any single person I know. You know, culture is one of those words that sounds like it's highfalutin, sounds like it has to do with opera and ballet. I wish it did. But culture is something that, just like your infinite desire, is something all of you live in. I think the best metaphor for culture is oxygen. I love that moment from Moulin Rouge when Ewan McGregor says to Nicole Kidman, "Love is like oxygen." How many of you saw Moulin Rouge? It's oxygen because you breathe it in and it shapes you, your heart, your mind, your view of the world without you knowing it. It's like a lethal, odorless gas. Now, of course, if the culture is good, it's odorless and it's helping you. But if it's not, as it is now, it's hurting you. This is why our complaints about television are really a metaphor for our concern for culture in general. What my attitude is, I embrace the culture and I pick and choose from it. Television is wonderful in my view, but I choose what I watch. I use my television to watch the films I like, get some news, and watch golf. And that's all I do. And I try to, my wife is certainly the same way, and I think my kids, so far, treat it the same way. I mean, if I didn't have television, my daughter would never have seen all of Alfred Hitchcock's movies before the age of 14. When she was 10 years old, if you asked her what her favorite movie was, she would have said The Birds, of course, by Alfred Hitchcock. Now, it's hard to be happy in America for the simple reason that the culture is against happiness. It's against what the church teaches about happiness. It's against what any good philosopher has said about happiness. The culture is poisoned. What you're doing here is to try to take little bits of the culture back, beginning with the culture of your home, beginning with the culture of your own mind, then moving out to the culture of your parish, of the Catholic community in Wyoming. And you know, these kind of schools should be here before they should be anywhere else, because this school can have an impact, this 1 week can have an impact on all of Wyoming. Because it's small, it's compact, there's a network. This school over the years can have a transforming power in a way a school in Massachusetts or a school in Texas or a school in even a place like Florida couldn't touch. Then that's the beauty of doing it here. Aristotle says you can't be a happy person unless you live in a happy state. So the question of whether we can be happy in America is an important question, because it means that the rugged individualism that Big Bob Carlson talks about is something that runs into the stone wall of the fact that we live in community, that we are a part of a fabric, that we are affected by the people we live with. We live with bad people, we could probably get into bad. I have my favorite golf pro is an old cohort of Sammy Snead and Ben Hogan and Jimmy DeMeritt. His name's Jackie Burke. Jack Burke Jr., Catholic guy, great Catholic, loves Crisis magazine. Never went to college, was beaten into civility by the bazillions down in Texas at a place called St. Thomas High School. And I'll sit with him in his office at the club in Houston. He founded the great Champions golf course in Houston, Texas. And he says, Deal, the trouble with people is they don't come from a good house. I can tell what kind of house people come from the moment I meet them. They have parents who love them, who taught them right from wrong. Poor people that don't come from a good house. It's very simple in some way. This is what Mitch has been talking about. We are indispensable only to our family. And in fact, lots of times I've asked, well, what are you going to do after Crisis magazine? And I'll say, I'm not going anywhere, because you know what? I'm the only guy I know that can do what I'm doing at Crisis magazine. But there are lots of people to do the other things that I might be asked to do. I'm where I should be. So that is the meaning, by the way, of the Catholic term solidarity. Solidarity means that our lives, our existence, our levels of happiness, our virtues are necessarily affected by the people we live with, the people we're in community with. It means that it's very difficult to be a good boy and girl in a bad family. It's very difficult to be a virtuous adult in a corrupt environment. Because, remember John Donne's famous phrase, "No man is an island." We are deeply affected and influenced by the expectations of the others around us. This is why the historian Gertrude Himmelfarb some years ago wrote a book about the loss of shame. I mean, how did we get someone like Bill Clinton, except that this country no longer elicited shame? I think Bill Bennett wrote a book about that as well. So we live in community, in solidarity. All of us need good people to be a good person. After all, isn't this what the church self teaches us by reminding us that we belong to a body? We just can't go it alone, no matter how much we may admire what John Wayne stood for. No matter how much you Westerners, and I'm Southwesterner, may think that heroism is possible. Isn't it said, Mitch, that it takes a family 4 generations to make a saint? I've heard that said. Because it takes the work of many people to make a saint. Many mothers and fathers and grandfathers to build that up. I mean, I'm the first generation in my family. I'm hoping my daughter's or my son's grandchild will be a saint. Then they can look back to me and say, "That son of a gun got the whole thing started." Amazing what God can do. Now, we're here to talk about whether it's possible to be happy in America. I think all of us agree that in the present situation, it's very difficult. We live in a narcissistic culture dominated by concern for self-esteem. We've had profoundly bad leadership in our country. Our Catholic politicians majority of our Catholic politicians in the Congress are pro-abortion. A slight majority of our Catholic politicians in the House are pro-life. But if you take them all together, the Catholic politicians in our Congress outnumber the pro-abortion Catholic politicians, outnumber the pro-life Catholic politicians by a good number. It's an embarrassment. I was on a conference call with the White House an hour ago. I have one every week. And one of the Catholic liaisons to the White House was saying that he was at the Knights of Columbus convention just a few days ago in Washington. And the president of the Knights of Columbus was talking about how the Knights nationally were going to get involved in the debate over judicial nominations and the anti-Catholic bias being shown. And applause was erupting, and people were just stomping and waving and so forth. And a Knight of Columbus from Massachusetts stood up and interrupted him and said, "I want you to send money to all the chapters in Massachusetts. We want to lead a recall to take pro-abortion Catholic Ted Kennedy out of his senatorial seat." And the place went crazy. The tide is turning. The tide is turning. And we can all be part of that effort. Now, was Cardinal George of Chicago, who's a brilliant man, has a scholar's mind. He told me on the phone once, shortly after he became cardinal, that he thought the United States of America was corrupt at its root. corrupt from the founding of America. And corrupt for the very reason that Dr. Carlson discussed last night, that our nation was created to be individualists. That our nation wasn't created to be a community seeking the common good. But our nation was created on the back of the Enlightenment philosophy that elevated the individual over the community, and particularly elevated the pursuit of pleasure of the individual over the common good of society. And we argued, and I said, Cardinal, you need to read my book. You just got Jefferson wrong. But he's a pretty tough-minded man, and he was absolutely sure he had it right. I think he's wrong. He's not entirely wrong, because his point certainly is part of the American tradition, but I don't think it's the part the founders intended. I don't think it's what the Declaration tells us. But let's go back just a little bit historically and see how Jefferson came to utter the words he did about the inalienable, not unalienable, the inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness. In the late 1700s in France, one of the most interesting periods in history. If any of you are interested, read history, I encourage you to pick up a good book on the French Revolution, because not only was the Catholic Church attacked and essentially wiped out in France, but a lot of the things we're struggling with in this class were really born in the time of the French Revolution. But it was uttered by one of the leaders that a new idea has been born in Europe, and it's the idea of happiness. If you go back into any database and type in happiness or the French bonheur or any of the Italian words or German words, and you sort of put parameters 1750 to 1820, and you hit the button, you will get literally hundreds of treatises on happiness. And they're fascinating to read. Never has any age, I think even more than the Greeks, been obsessed by the idea of happiness. Why? Because they were obsessed with the idea that for the first time in the history of the West, they were free, relatively free from the authority, the ancient authorities of church, kings, and the aristocracy. They were free, as it were, to make choices, to experience liberty in a new way, and they were free to, as it were, test waters, test boundaries that the old order never allowed them to do. Now, it's very easy for us to ho-hum that. But put yourself in the shoes of someone, the difference between, say, the generation of 1720 or 30, or the generation of 1790, literally one generation apart. Someone who was born to essentially serve in a kind of post-feudal environment, no options, you're born into one occupation, you're going to be on the land your parents and great-grandparents were, and someone born into a revolutionary environment where you can change social classes, you're not consigned to the poverty of your parents, you can be involved in government, and that's the key. You can be involved, you can be active, you can have a vote, you can help make laws. Now this wouldn't become complete in Europe until about 1850. I believe the last European ruler was not overthrown until the Russian Revolution of 1917. But in the late 1840s, a lot of the old feudal monarchs were finally overthrown, and the American and French Revolution ideals were realized in Europe. But just think, all of a sudden, you can be part of the thing that ruled you and you had to obey. That's pretty exciting, pretty heady stuff. And so you had the idea emerge of political happiness, meaning that the happiness that the medievals and the Renaissance scholars talked about was primarily a happiness available only to a few people. Monks, scholars who contemplate, maybe the great families like the Medicis, the great families whose wealth gave them the leisure time to surround themselves with artists and philosophers and priests, private chapels, and so forth. The idea that happiness could be available to everyone and not just the chosen few elite was both fueling these revolutionary ideals and integral to the new understanding of politics. Now, let me ask you what I think is an easy question. This will be a kind of a test. If you're looking, I love that stuff. If you're looking at the difference between a happiness of contemplation or a happiness of sanctity that was available to the elites of scholarship and the elites of religion, but then wanted to find a form of happiness that could belong to everybody and everybody could have a right to, what would be the kind of happiness, the only kind of happiness that could be available in that way and that everybody could have a right to? What do all human beings have the ability to do? Not all human beings can become philosophers contemplating first principles. It's very hard for a human being to become a saint. Especially in those days, remember that there was a much greater divide between clergy and laity. But if you want a happiness that can be given to everybody, what is it going to be? It's got to be what? Pleasure. That's the only thing that fits the bill. Because even the poorest peasant has a body, has nerve endings, has the ability to get pleasure out of life. Now, what is that going to become through Freud in the 20th century? It's going to become sexual gratification. Because everybody can do that too. And what did Freud say happiness was? I heard whispered orgasm. Yes, happiness is an orgasm. But what the 18th and 19th century revolutionaries had in mind, when that first article of the Declaration of the Rights of Man was written, and all human beings have a right to happiness, they had in mind a pleasurable life. Now, what does that mean government does? Now, the interesting thing about the impact of these ideas on politics is that it doesn't lead to just one model of government's relation to happiness. It leads to two. And I think they can be labeled liberal and conservative. And this has very kind of immediate consequences for us in making our political choices. Because if everybody has a right to happiness, now remember there's a big difference between a right to happiness and a right to pursuit of happiness. Think about it. But some people take that to mean that government has to provide happiness for everybody. I mean, you gotta regardless of what a person does or what a person is, you've got to provide them happiness. Now, in the context of pleasure, what does that mean? You've got to make them feel good about themselves. You've got to give them whatever it is it takes. That takes a lot of government. That takes a lot of shrinks on the payroll to do that. It takes a lot of money to make sure that all of your citizens are feeling good about themselves all the time. Now, naturally, that leads to a pretty big government, doesn't it? I mean, a big government. And that idea, once it was unleashed in Europe, is still around. Because you listen to politicians, even the good ones, they fall right into this, that government has to do this for people, government has to provide for this, we have to make sure our citizens have this and have that. But the other form of government in relation to happiness is a more, might say, restrained view, and that is this: that government exists in order to protect the citizen's right to pursue happiness. In other words, a government recognizes that the right to pursue happiness is in human nature. It belongs to human nature prior to even governments existing. So government exists in order to protect the exercise of that right to pursue happiness. It doesn't have to give the things that cause happiness. It doesn't have to provide the objects of happiness, but it has to allow people to pursue it. Just as Jefferson would write, the government has to protect the right to life and liberty. Now, I happen to think that distinction is a very important one in looking at contemporary political life, and I would encourage somebody to ask a question about that tonight in our discussion. But if happiness is for everybody, then the easiest way to get or to deliver that happiness for everybody is to make pleasure available. Now, I said at the first lecture I wanted to share with you my discovery of the turning point in all of intellectual history of when happiness started to become psychological. Now, admittedly, my reading is not comprehensive. I've read a lot, but I know there's lots more to read, because it's directly relevant on the issue of what is the American legacy of happiness. In the 1500s, there was a philosopher named Marsilio Ficino, and boy did he have a great setup. He lived in Florence, and the family that took care of him, they were called what? They were called, if you have a sponsor,
Patron.
what? Benefactor. The de Medici family, specifically Lorenzo de Medici, set him up in a huge estate and filled his rooms with the greatest philosophical library of the Renaissance. He was a scholar of Plato. And he would write his benefactor letters, and they exchanged letters. And of course, Lorenzo was no slouch himself. Lorenzo wrote a sonnet on happiness, which he sent to Marsilio, to which Ficino responded with the following thought. He said this. He said, over the centuries, the philosophers and theologians have said that happiness consists in the vision of God as created by the intellect when it sees the divine essence and comes to rest in it. mean, that's as far as you can go. Of course, this happens in heaven, right? Ficino said, you know what? I don't think happiness consists in that resting of the intellect in God. It exists really in the turning, the moment when the will turns toward God, be prior to doing that. In other words, it exists in the moment of change when the will, not the intellect, or when the love turns toward God in order to achieve vision. Now that sounds like a very arcane thing, and it is. It's arcane. But it's crucial, because what does it do? Remember, we have said that final happiness comes when infinite desire comes to rest, when we stop our restlessness. Ficino's saying happiness isn't in the resting, it's in the motion. Happiness is in the turning, in the, he called it conversion. This thing that, see, the Renaissance was a time of action, a time of doing. So Ficino was expressing this value that the Renaissance had and the Enlightenment would have in motion as opposed to rest. Motion, dynamism, as opposed to rest. That's extremely important. I mean, how many times have you heard people say, it's the journey, not the destination, that's important? That's profoundly wrong. The destination is everything. I mean, if we are Christians, and I think we are, then it's the destination that counts, and it's the destination that defines the journey you're going to take. I mean, the journey is fun. The journey is thrilling. But if you don't get to the destination, you're going to hell. You know? You know, and it's obviously, that sounded really Baptist, didn't it? Yeah. Put a coat and tie on me, and there it is. You know, it's right there.
Yeah, preach it, brother.
All around the stadium. Amen. You're here. You're here. The buses will wait. They will. All right. Now, so that was the turning point in the history of happiness. Not coming to rest in God, but enjoying the journey, enjoying the turning. You know, that attitude, which of course in Ficino is highly sophisticated, highly philosophical, if you popularize that attitude, happiness becomes completely relative. Enjoy whatever you do, because that's your happiness. Whatever you have chosen, because the destination isn't important. Now, where did Jefferson stand in relation to all this? People know that Jefferson was a great scholar, he was a philosopher himself, read deeply in classical philosophers in the original languages. He had one of the greatest libraries in 18th century America. Of course, he lived into the 19th century. And those of you that have been to Monticello will realize he's a great architect, laid out the University of Virginia. You know, quite a man, ambassador to Paris. And you know all the rumors and so forth about his love life. So he was not your typical ivory tower scholar, a great man of the world. And you've read my chapter, and so you know what I'm going to say, but let me simplify it for you. A lot of people look at all that Jefferson read. Epicurus was a favorite of him. You know, Epicurus was a good philosopher, and he was a eudaemonist. He believed that the virtuous pursuit of happiness, or pleasure, brought happiness. Not just pleasure, the virtuous pursuit. He was a virtue philosopher. But he looked at all of the philosophers that influenced him, and, you know, there's arguments pro and con about whether or not Jefferson's idea of the right to pursue happiness was a happiness of anything goes, including psychological happiness, or was it a happiness of capitalism, of just acquiring property and being successful in doing that, or having enough land and food? There's been all kinds of books written. And I read all the books, and I came to the following conclusion. I think it's defensible. That, and you can read in my book, or in that chapter, the quote that I think really makes the case as follows. That when Jefferson wrote in the Declaration that the government should recognize that we have an inalienable right, meaning one that can't be taken away because it belongs to nature. That's what that means. You can't be separated from it. The government tries to separate you from it. The government is not to be obeyed. That's what Thomas Aquinas said. That's what Martin Luther King said, quoting Thomas Aquinas when he wrote from the Birmingham jail. It says natural law trumps positive law. That's what civil disobedience truly is. Jefferson believed that nature and nature's God instilled in us, in human beings, in God's creation, a desire of benevolence, meaning a desire to help others. And that it would be natural for human beings, as they pursue their happiness, not to pursue it egotistically or self-centeredly, but would very likely, because nature ordained it this way, to pursue it benevolently, virtuously. So in a broad sense, Jefferson belongs to this eudaimonism thing that I've been talking about. He is a eudaimonist. He's a eudaimonist of an 18th century type. It has deep flaws, as Father Shaw or anybody here could explain. It has deep flaws. But the point to be made is that for Jefferson, he believed that the pursuit of happiness should be done virtuously. And the guarantee of that is the natural law of benevolence built in to human nature. Now, we can obviously pick a fight with that. It sounds pretty optimistic. I mean, the biggest problem with it is that it makes pleasure the end of life and not God. I mean, what we see, the big picture is that most of these 18th century pursuits of happiness, out of which America was born, have lost the idea that God is the end of our infinite desire. And they have made a pleasurable life or a satisfied life the end of our desire, which of course it can't be. What Jefferson is saying is that we know that even as we pursue these kind of lives, we're going to help other people because that's our nature. We're not going to find pleasure in hurting others. We're not going to find self-esteem or self-love. Even John Locke thought this. John Locke's a terribly interesting guy. He's full of all kind of contradictions, terribly, terribly bright. And he really thought, Locke thought that preaching was preaching about heaven and hell was really important, because once people got into their minds the idea of an eternal place of pleasure versus an eternal place of pain, that would straighten them up. That they would, their actions, their deeds would be so shaped by the vision of heaven or hell that they'd live good lives. So he really thought the greatest motivating factor in life was the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Now I want to end not with a quotation from Thomas Aquinas, but a quick story about the philosopher John Stuart Mill. How many of you have heard about John Stuart Mill? Really interesting guy. Wrote a book called On Liberty, known as a utilitarian. His father was a real utilitarian. I mean, pleasure and pain guided everything, even the fact that he taught his son Latin at the age of 4 or Greek or something like that. But Mill was brought up as a kind of philosophical experiment. He was brought up very strictly according to the rigid rules of utilitarian philosophy. And Mill tried to follow it, and he had a nervous breakdown. And he had a nervous breakdown because he realized that his life was not fulfilled by this very sort of scientific, calculated approach to life in accruing pleasure and avoiding pain. And his mode of recovery was reading the poetry of William Wordsworth. Reading the romantic poetry, the very kind of thing that his father had said was not worth his time. And what came out of that encounter with Wordsworth was the realization that psychological satisfaction is not necessarily the mark of a good life. That sometimes dissatisfaction, suffering, and pain is preferable. And here's how he put it, a wonderful quote I'd like for you to write down as our final quote for this session. It's following. He said, "It's better to be a dissatisfied Socrates. It's better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig." It's better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. We all know, everyone in this room knows that Socrates was put to death. He was put to death, a death he could have avoided. He had the ability to escape from jail. But he stayed, and he drank the hemlock, and he died a death he could have gotten out of. He was dissatisfied at the end of his life. Why? Because he was going to lose his friends. He was going to lose his life. And he was going to leave behind people who would miss him. And he would no longer be able to make a contribution to the city that he loved. But better to be Socrates martyred than to be a pig in your tastes and in your aspirations and be satisfied. Thank you very much.